I wish we could go back to those days because it's far worse now. The CIA, in its very legalistic manner, said, well, we don't any longer have paid relationships with journalists, blah, blah, blah. No, they don't need to. Those guys are jumping over each other to get a relationship with CIA. And it's not just the agency that's involved, it's the Pentagon, which spends billions of dollars every single year managing its social profile, including not just paying off journalists and dealing with them, but at creating what they call sock puppets. That is basically trolls. Under all the news articles that you read online, some of them are literally paid U.S. Defense Department employees whose job is to create persona, to influence public opinion on news stories. Yeah, they do that to you. They do that to me. Based on my tax dollars, I'm helping to fund that. That's kind of insulting. So the whole management of the media is so thorough. And again, I could do an all-day lecture on this. It is a thorough penetration and betrayal by the media of their job, which is to inform us in an unbiased way. But that's the way it is. That's what the mainstream media is. Corporate and military intelligence community domination. They did it back in the 40s, they do it today. And all the other things that they do. The academic world, same thing, no different. Back, hell, when I was a grad student a million years ago in the 80s and 90s, God, my advisor, I am convinced, was probably working some way for the CIA. I know it sounds paranoid, but his father was an OSS officer during the war, probably, I think, killed some people. His father was a great scholar of Greek literature. My advisor, I'm not going to mention his name, but if it comes back, he's going to get ticked, but was served in Vietnam as an intelligence officer and did a stint at the Princeton Institute of Advanced Study and also the London School of Economics, all U.S. intelligence hangouts. I'm pretty sure he was. It's typical with the academic world. You get to there's a revolving door. And it's not that the CIA can control every single professor that exists in the U.S. Clearly not. But the way it was is that you have a couple of big shots, and they round up the sheep. So if some associate professor at some community college gets interested in UFOs, some of the big shots at Harvard will smack them down. In the old days, that was Donald Menzel, who I showed in the last lecture. Leading skeptical hypothesis proponent, was also on the secretly with the NSA, high level cryptographer. No one knew this. Not even his wife. Researcher Stanton Friedman found it out after Menzel died. So there's all of these connections. They do exist. They are real. This is how you keep the people in line. And it doesn't work 100% every time, but it can work pretty well. And I think this is what happened in the 40s. I think this is still exactly what is happening today. World of science can be controlled very easily. If you're a scientist, you know it's all about funding. Where do you get your funding from? Well, you get your funding from the government. In the U.S., the government's one of the key sources. Industry is the other one. And you go where the money is. And if the UFO subject is classified, then the funding will only be classified. It's not going to be out in the open. So that's how it is. So it's really not that hard. Continuing further with this scenario, all right. Black agencies and budgets. So basically the black budget is classified spending that members of Congress, in this case, don't know where the money's going. There might be a little line that indicates a vague, meaningless title of a program, and they just approve it. No one really knows how big the black budget is. Estimates $30 to $50 billion a year. That's a lot of money. I think it's actually much more than that, because I think the real black budget includes not simply federal classified tax dollars, but things like, securities fraud, narco trafficking proceeds, financial shenanigans that have gone on forever. In terms of drug trafficking, no one knows how big that industry is, but it's certainly one of the biggest in the world. And just because it's illegal doesn't mean that no one wants that money. That's a lot of money. Whether your name is the CIA or the FSB, I suppose, or the Pakistani ISI or the Mossad, whoever you are, you want that money. That's a lot. If you want to rig elections, raise secret armies, do all the other things that intelligence agencies do, blow up buildings and blame it on terrorists, it all requires a lot of money. And drug trafficking is one way that that happens. I don't know that this money goes into the UFO program, but I suspect it does. I guess I'll just leave it at that for the moment. So I'm talking about illegal criminal financing, runaway privatized secrecy. So there haven't been many studies of what we call the black budget, but there have been a few. And they've all indicated that what we're dealing with is not a system dominated by the Pentagon per se. It's dominated by the private contractors. So Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, General Electric. That's where the money is. And that's where the dominant power often seems to be. And with these so-called special access programs, or SAPs, SAPs, these are the primordial black budget programs. We don't really have a handle on this in our public life. We don't know how many there are. We don't really know who's running them. A number of years ago, I read a story about the U.S. Navy. They don't even have control over theirs. Forget Congress. The military agencies themselves are often unable to control all of these little squirreled away, privatized, labyrinthine organizations that exist pretty much off the grid within the military and intelligence community. Within the U.S. anyway, this system has gotten so big, it's so out of control. I really don't know if anyone's ever going to get a hold over this. It's enormous, and involves, it's semi-private, semi-public. It's a little bit of both. One of the things that they're doing, and this now I think we can say we have proof of this, is that they're weaponizing this technology. And I say proof. There's something known as the Condign Report. This is out of the UK in the late 90s. And my friend and colleague John Burroughs did the work, and he uncovered this. A lot of us let it slide by, including myself, because it's a big fat 400-page dry as dust report that was apparently declassified accidentally by the UK. But there's gold in there. And one of the things, because John has, because he was at Rendlesham in 1980 and suffered to this day heart issues as a result of the event. Something happened to him when he was there. And anyway, in the Condign Report, so he went through it carefully, and he saw that there were very clear, open references within this classified paper to UAP, unexplained aerial phenomena, and the effects of UAP on human physiology, and it's not a good effect, and also references to weaponizing that technology. And of course it makes perfect sense. I mean, these are military people. This is how they think. If you get exotic technology, or if you have access to studying it, or if you have access to having it, you're gonna create weapons out of it. This is probably in a global competition with other black budget agencies, maybe Russian or maybe Chinese now. And then, of course, you're going to hide your breakthroughs. This is where I come over the breakaway civilization. So some breakthroughs might be really great money makers, high tensile fibers, or maybe lasers, or maybe fiber optics. My friend Dr. Bob Wood believes, and he made I think a pretty good case for the fact even the transistor itself from 1947 might derive not from Roswell, which was from 47, but from Cape Girardeau, which was 1941. And his case isn't a bad one. It's not a bad one. In any case, you might make some breakthroughs that are great money makers. Other breakthroughs might be a little bit too important to hide, whether they're energy breakthroughs, propulsion breakthroughs. I mean, you can kind of see why. If they have a propulsion breakthrough, like anti-gravity, electrogravitics, something along these lines, which many people suspect, that'd be pretty nice. Wouldn't it be nice to have your own little flying saucer? I flew from Vancouver to Sydney. It took 16 hours. I'd like to do a little bit faster than that if I could. And if you have the ability, that's a lot of power. That's a lot of freedom. If there's a non-petroleum based energy source, maybe some version of zero-point energy, maybe. I did a free energy or a breakthrough energy conference in Boulder, Colorado a few years ago. I was there, one UFO researcher. I met a lot of very fascinating energy researchers, and what became very clear to me, I don't know if all of their ideas are valid, but I think some of them probably are. What I learned is that there's a lot of brilliant people in this world right now who are thinking about these energy breakthroughs. I have to think those are real. Now, right now, I think that some of them are probably classified. And if we had an energy breakthrough, if you could have a little device that could allow you to go off the grid And it could say, up yours here, utility company. That's more freedom and that's more power. So breakthroughs like that, I think, are dangerous from the point of view of the power structure. They're dangerous from the point of view of control. And if we have, and I'm going to get a little more into this in a moment, but basically what we're dealing with is a theft of the planet by this many people over all of the water, all the minerals, all the genetically modified foods they want to shove down your throat for the rest of your life. They want to own every single thing in the world. And they're going for it, by the way. And that means control. But ways for us to break the control are not good from their point of view. And I think energy breakthroughs are one, and those would be hidden. But that wouldn't mean that they wouldn't continue studying it on their own. No, they would continue. And maybe those breakthroughs might involve maybe their own version of flying saucers, their own ability to go off-world. Is this the case? I believe it is the case. Is there a secret space program? I believe there is a secret space program. I do not believe, I'll just take this moment to say, most of the current batch of whistleblowers or self-described whistleblowers who have talked about going to Mars. I'm not on board. I'm not on board their Mars spaceship or jump room. I'm not saying I know that they're not telling the truth, but I don't believe that they're telling the truth. I do believe other whistleblowers, primarily those who are a little more cautious and in the past, who do not talk about reverse time engineering and the like. I just don't buy it. But I do believe the whistleblowers like Donna Hare from the early 1970s, who worked for Philco Ford, a subcontractor for NASA, when she talked about how NASA airbrushed photographs regularly about the moon and airbrushing out UFOs. I do believe whistleblowers like Carl Wolf, who in the 1960s was at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, talking as well about photographs that he saw dealing with structures on the far side of the moon. And I do believe that there are a large number of anomalies in space that signify an infrastructure that is not supposed to exist, but it does, and that there's something going on. So I think that, and there may be something with Mars as well. I'm not denying this. I had a long conversation, well, long enough conversation with a very brilliant scientist who said to me early on in my research, he said, don't discount the Mars anomalies. There are those of us who are looking at it very carefully. And he had very good connections, excellent connections to the classified world. So my attitude about a secret space program is that it's extremely probable, and a lot of things point to it. The last thing I would say on it is, if I were in charge of security over a secret space program and I didn't want you guys to know about it, I might just, knowing it's 2016 and we can all talk to each other and do research, I might just litter the field with a lot of nonsense and put some people out there to say certain things that are not credible and make sure they get in front of people who will put them on video and plaster them to the rest of the world. Because there are definitely people who are absolutely willing to interview anyone, literally anyone, with a story. And we do know the intelligence communities have a long history of disinfo on UFOs. So I would just say, don't necessarily believe every single thing that comes along your Facebook feed. But having said that, I believe there's a secret space program, and I absolutely believe that these military-minded people are desperately trying to catch up to them. I say them, whoever they are, these others, as other beings. Again, they think in military terms. And they're desperately attempting to catch up to these other beings, but they're also, again, in competition with any other groups that may be working on this covertly. I had a person who emailed me a couple of years ago. I don't know who this guy was, but he talked a good game, I'll say that. He was very intelligent. And he wrote and said, Mr. Dolan, I read your book After Disclosure. Pretty good book, he said, but you missed something important. He said, you really did not appreciate how panicky and frightened we all are if this were to come out. He said, you're not going to get any, no one will get any cooperation from the black world on this subject unless we are certain that we're not going to be followed around by the torches and pitchforks crowd. He didn't say that, but that's my, he said, unless we're certain that we will not be prosecuted for criminal, for secrecy about this, because there'll be a lot of angry people. And he said, unless we are absolutely sure that we will not be prosecuted, we're just not going to cooperate. And actually, I think I did mention this in After Disclosure, maybe not as much or as strongly as he would have liked. I do think it's a huge issue. The CYA, cover your ass rule, and this and there. I think they're afraid of what would happen. I think a bigger fear, at least among those people at the very top, might just be the implications, the revolutionary implications to our society if all of this scenario were to come out. And this was the theme of After Disclosure, which I do believe is a very revolutionary development. You know, if President Obama were to go on TV tomorrow, as my friend Stephen Bassett believes that President Obama is going to do disclosure before his term is out. I'm like, Stephen, whatever you are smoking, give me some. I want this optimism. I don't believe it. But if he were to say such a thing, can you imagine? How would he do this? It's come to my attention that some of what we call the UFO phenomenon is real. Well, I'm going on a long vacation. See you all later. I mean, there's a lot of follow-up questions. Very unfun follow-up questions like, really, so you've been lying, the government's been lying for the last 70 years? How have you been lying to us? How's the political institutions of our country and the world not been apprised of this? Where's the media been? Where's the academic community? Have you been manipulating our media? Well, yeah, obviously. So a lot of uncomfortable questions. What about the black budget world? Have you been reverse engineering alien technology, underground bases? I mean, it will never end. And you know, there are people with what we might call a dog-like obedience to authority, and they won't ask any questions. But not all of us are like that. Probably none of us in this room are like that. So there'll be a lot of people with questions. So this is, and it's not simply the political blowback, it's the energy paradigm transformation. I think is fundamental. You know, if you admit that this is real, it's going to be all of 5 minutes before people also realize, oh wow, those flying saucers are probably using something other than petrol to go from here to here, maybe something a little bit better. And whatever that better is, it implies a post-petroleum paradigm to our world, which is the most fundamental transformation that I can imagine to human civilization, getting us off of petroleum. Okay, next slide, please. That was a long slide. I don't think any of the others will be this slide. And actually, we're going to skip past this. So the probable scenario, I was talking about these beings, what's going on. Let's just skip past this slide. Skip past. I think they came here, they're very advanced, they can manipulate space-time, they're artificially created. I talked about all of this. Let's go on. And let's just go on off of this. I talked about all of this before. So let's stay on this for a minute. So we've got a secret human infrastructure. We have a covert, let's say, alien presence. We'll just use that for the sake of argument. And I just came up with this little graphic a couple of weeks ago. I like this so far. So this is how I envision our layers of reality. In the center is where we are, or at least where we start out. Mass reality. It's the brightest circle. And it's where all the attention is focused. So like, you know, Kim Kardashian inhabits there when you turn on the TV. There's Kim's ass, hello. There's your football game and dancing with the whatever. The mass dum-dum reality that we're bombarded with every single day. My God, what has happened to human civilization? And this is what we're bombarded with all the time. And then the idiocy of, like in the US, of CNN reality, which is the dumbest, most incomprehensible, confusing form of reality for news that I can imagine. Maybe you probably have something as bad here for all I know. So that's mass reality. But one step beyond that, one leap beyond that I call academic reality. And like, you know, first time you go to university, you're like, oh, wow, Noam Chomsky, or, oh yes, you know, left critique of contemporary culture, whatever it is. And you think, oh yes, I can see beyond the stupid television reality. And you think, this is how things are, you know? Donald Trump's an asshole, or whatever. That's like academic reality. So okay, good. That's a little bit better than the dumb Kardashian reality. But it's really not the true reality. And beyond that, you get into what I call classified reality. The classified world is almost always beyond the academic world. When I was working on a history PhD, which I didn't finish, okay, I did two partials. I did two partial dissertations. I wrote 250 pages total of dissertation material. I didn't finish my diss, so there you go. But in the academic world, when I was studying, I studied the CIA as an academic student. It's very, very hard to get like really like the true, because the nature of the intelligence world is that you're not going to know about it. If they're doing their job, it's secret. And academicians, like, I think they forget. Like, they kind of know, but then they forget. They think, well, it's classified, and historians in particular, we like to work with documents. We like to be very factually based. That's fair, that's good, but the liability is that you tend to forget. If it's not available to you, you just kind of pretend it's not there, but it is there. There's an enormous, in the US, there's a book called Blank Check by, what the hell's his name? It'll come. Anyone know Blank Check? All right, it'll come to me. A UK writer too. Anyway, he made the case based on his own, admittedly, maybe somewhat limited study, but he believes that more than 50% of all US government documents are in one form or another. Oh, Trevor Paglen wrote it. He said more than 50% of US government documents in one form or another are classified. And so that means, if you look at it, if I'm trying to look at the history of my government, you could really argue that half of its activity or more is secret. So that's a little bit beyond the little academic reality, isn't it? So it's the classified reality. And you notice each layer gets a little darker, a little harder to see. And then beyond that is what I call the breakaway reality. Because the classified world, that's a big world. But the world that deals with this subject that we're here to talk about, that's a very, very limited part of the classified world. Very limited. And that's way beyond what you get in the classified world. And then you've got, beyond that, it's this the reality of these other beings, which I think is actually quite far beyond even the breakaway civilization. So there's all of these levels of reality that we're going through. Okay, let's keep going. Next slide. Wasn't that a fun little transition? I didn't put any graphics in here. I just threw this slide together just the other day. So, and it sort of belongs here and it sort of doesn't, but let's just talk about it. So what's driving us into the future? Well, we're moving into a very crazy future, I think we can all gather. So in terms of hardware, there's this thing called Moore's Law. Many of you know about it. Charles Moore in the 1960s talked about how every 18 to 24 months, the number of transistors seem to be doubling on all the integrated circuits. That's been modified. That's held true. And Moore's Law has been expanded really to include just general computing power. And it really does seem to be doubling. Now there's talk that maybe Moore's Law is hitting its limit. Well, maybe, but it's still going after almost about 50 years. We're in a massively exploding increase of computing power. We all have seen this in our own lives with our personal computers. Beyond that, advances in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, nanotech, robotics, 3D printing and scanning, DNA mapping, gene editing. I talked about CRISPR a little bit before, and brain mapping. Next slide. I got one more of these. Implants for greater abilities, so like think super soldiers. That's happening now. Genetic modifications for intelligence, strength, immunity. That is, again, if you can afford it. You read these futurists. They're really frightening people to me. I don't know about you. They scare the hell out of me. I mean, I've read many of Ray Kurzweil's books, and he's brilliant, and I love reading him, but these people, I don't know what kind, you know, they're smoking something really fun too. Like they just believe, oh, it's going to be great. We're going to live forever. We're going to be like the gods. No negative repercussions. Really? I think there's a lot of negative repercussions. I can think of many. It just doesn't seem quite right to me. Maybe my imagination's stifled here, but I also don't believe, not for an instant, that these breakthroughs are going to be for all of us. I just somehow don't believe it. I somehow have this nagging fear that there's going to be a few people who will be able to leverage this awesome technology for their descendants, but maybe not for yours or mine. I don't know about you, but my bank account's not quite ready to afford some of these breakthroughs. And I could easily see a class-based transhumanism. I mean, a real live frightening version of what Hitler and those guys were trying to come up with, that is a true race-based, almost species, you know, their kids be smarter and stronger and have better immunity, and maybe like the gods. Are they going to seem like that? It's already happening in a sense. I mean, you've got a complete dumbed down culture, and you've got a very, very, like the super rich live like, they do live like gods. but maybe they'll be like gods in the future biologically. That's my fear. What else? Oh, population profiling, including predictive modeling, like, Minority Report. That's happening now. They're actually moving toward this. Oh yeah, based on your web searches and your merchandising and who knows. One of the galling things, you open Google Gmail and you get the ads that are custom designed for your emails, right? You've all probably seen this. What's interesting is that you have to assume someone has got your profile. You don't have your profile. Wouldn't that be nice? I'd like my profile. So there's someone somewhere who probably knows each of us better than we may know ourselves in certain key ways. That's a bit galling. But I think that's only going to increase. And not simply with your web-based behavior, probably with a lot of things that we can't even think about. Facial recognition, that's happening now. Voice recognition, very advanced. Comprehensive surveillance, whether through insect drones or let your imagination wander. I mean, total surveillance of society. This is happening. We're probably a generation away or less from a comprehensive blanket coverage of all of us. Oh yeah, mind-reading technologies. I read this just maybe a month ago. So with electrodes hooked up to your brain, if you're thinking words, this apparently, I didn't know this, produces certain brain waves. Specific brain waves that can be decoded with the proper algorithm. And they're at the point, I know, it's creepy, 90% accuracy. Now that's if you're thinking the words, and they've got wires hooked up to you, so it's still a little clunky, but it's a little scary. And what's crazy is that the spin on these articles, this just drives me nuts. It's like, wow, so wonderful, we could help people who are deaf and dumb and blind and can't really, think of things, and they can just think of the words now. They can't say, I don't think that's how they spun it, but basically, like, if you're severely disabled, wow, how wonderful. Well, I could see a lot of other really creepy applications to this, and they may not in the future all involve wires, right? I don't know how far they're going to get with this. Anyway, we're moving into this. It's all happening. And what's the last thing? Oh yeah, ultra-fast, ultra-intelligent machines, robots, virtual entities, that is on your computer. The super intelligent IQ of 500 helper, a little bit better than Siri. That's all coming down the road. Okay, so next slide. So with that in mind, just like keep that parked in your mind. This is the future we're moving toward. And there's a lot of other socioeconomic things we're moving toward at the same time I'll talk about. So let's talk about disclosure for a moment. This is a subject that is not a new subject. The word is relatively new, last 15 years, but the concept is really not new. It goes back to the 50s. In the US in particular, and this is something I really did study a lot, there have been movements throughout, civilian movements, to end UFO secrecy. And there was a group in the US called NICAP, led by Donald E. Kehoe, retired US Marine, who was friends with the former CIA director, Roscoe Hillenkoetter, and they were pretty well connected in Washington, D.C., and their belief in the 50s was that, the U.S. had a functioning democratic system. It was basically the belief back then. And that in that system, you would work through Congress. That's a logical, logical policy, a logical attitude. Work through Congress, there are representatives, and let's have congressional leaders talk about ending the secrecy on these flying saucers. And NICAP tried actually many times to do this, and frequently at the 11th hour the rug was pulled out from underneath them, and it didn't happen. Well, we kind of know why, because even in the 50s, America was really an oligarchy and an authoritarian system. There's been a lot of good studies on this. A sociologist named C. Wright Mills wrote a book called The Power Elite in the 50s. He was not in the mainstream at the time, but he was absolutely right. And Mills said, look, Americans like to say they're this democratic society. They're really based on a power structure. Well, today we kind of take that as a given. And there's been many, many studies subsequently that have proven, absolutely proven, that in US politics, I'm sure here too, I'm sure everywhere, that what we have are oligarchs and that the laws that are passed are designed specifically for those groups that have the money and the power to make the laws happen. To the extent that poor people get anything in the legal system, it's only because those interests coincide with the wealthy on certain occasions. That's in the US, and that was done, I think, by Harvard or Yale University recently. Maybe Princeton. It was one of those three. So if you have an authoritarian system, one that's moving toward, if not already, essentially virtual fascism, neo-fascism, fascism in all but name. Sure, not 1935 Hitler fascism. It's never going to look like 1930s. We're not in the 1930s. We're in the 21st century. Fascism's not going to be called fascism. They're not going to be that stupid about it. They'll call it freedom. And they'll put Monday Night Football on TV for you to entertain you, and they'll show you the Kardashians and all of that nonsense. But it is fascism. When a government, I mean, and I'll just test my little Donald Trump thing here. So you have all the Americans saying, oh my God, Donald Trump's the next Hitler. Well, this is my take on it. When a government can read every email you've ever written, GPS you 24/7, that's called fascism. All right, the barn door opened 15 years ago. It was called the USA Patriot Act after 9/11. It's already happened. Americans have been living in that nightmare for a long time now. So if they're worried about fascism, they really need to look at some other things that have been going on. And in that world, since that's not a transparent government, it's an opaque government that knows more about me than I know about it. In that government, how do we achieve disclosure? Do I just work through Congress? 3 years ago, I was part of what was called a citizens hearing on disclosure. I was very glad to do it. I'm very proud that I was part of it. And we were a group of people who spoke to retired members of U.S. Congress. And it's on YouTube, and you can see a lot of it. And I feel it was valuable because I like that it's left a legacy, a cultural legacy that I'm hoping people now and in the future will refer back to. But is that really the way that we're going to get it, by going through Congress? Well, I'll tell you right now, those members of Congress didn't believe it. They all knew that system's broken. And I agree with them. That system is broken. I just don't see it happening. So if we don't have a true representative system, then what do we have and how do we achieve it? Well, I'll come back to that. Next slide, please. So yeah, meanwhile, let's go international now. I like that little graphic. So how does the secrecy work? I started out in this game looking at the US side of it. That made sense. I mean, I am an American, and the US is really the big player with this. It sure is, but it's not the only country in the world. There are 200 or so sovereign nations, at least in theory. So how does it work? I've gotten asked this question many times. I've thought about it. I think I'm going to offer my answer to you right now. Next slide, please. So one thing is, let's forget the nations, let's forget the countries, and let's look at a global power structure. So as I see it, we have a transnational financial and political elite. You know, they meet at like the so-called infamous Bilderberg meetings. Sure do. They also, if you want to go to an open Bilderberg meeting, it's called the Aspen Institute in Aspen, Colorado. You can go there. It's really the same thing. They're just a little more politically correct. But all the same people who attend the Bilderberg meetings, many of them will speak at the Aspen Institute, and they will tell you what their plan is for the future. And their plan, by the way, is to create well, they wouldn't say this, but it's a world in which they are the lords and we are the serfs working for them, and your children and your grandchildren, in a transnational global system that is micromanaged by them, because they are quite convinced that they know how to do this. They're quite convinced that they're smart enough, and they can manage you and they can manage me. So they've got it. Through the United States, which has, after all, the most ass-kicking military in the world, so you got to control the U.S. military, the U.S. intelligence community, and the U.S. And the black budget agencies within the U.S., NSA, NRO, that's the National Reconnaissance Office, both of which existed in total secrecy for a long time. The U.S. has a long tradition of powerful intelligence agencies that don't officially exist. I have a feeling that still is continuing. So through those agencies, through their relationships, partnerships with other nations, including Australia, and the so-called Five Eyes, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. That's US, Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, outed by a New Zealand journalist in the 90s, known as Project Echelon. I have a feeling it goes by a different name now. This is a global electronic intercept operation in which the NSA and the NSA equivalents of these nations share their data. Get around a lot of legal issues too, like spying on your own population. You know, so GCHQ might spy on the U.S. and give the information over to NSA. That's how it looks like. And Edward Snowden's revelations certainly dovetail with a lot of that. And so what happens is that the U.S. is, let's say, first among equals. I mean, there's way more money in the U.S. black budget infrastructure than here in Australia or in Britain even, or in Canada, or anywhere else for that matter. So the U.S. is the dog that gets to pee on everyone's tree. Sorry, but that's, I think, how it is, and dominates its relationship, but in partnerships. And nations like Australia are very high up, I think, in the level of those partnerships compared with a lot of other countries. So that's how that's the beginning of the secrecy. Next slide, please. But then, you know, that doesn't necessarily answer the question, why would nations remain silent? So first thing I have to say is most nations in this world are dominated by the United States. All right. If you look at something like global military spending, right? So the latest numbers that I have, I think, are from 2014. And 2014 numbers, the U.S. spends about 40% of global military spending. It's a lot. Second, by the way, is China, way down at 8% in 2014. Third is Russia at 3%. And then after China and Russia, they are the two nations that are near the top of the list that are not U.S., like closely integrated in the U.S. system. So all the others, Britain, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Poland, Australia, they're all up there. And when you look at the U.S. and its all of its allies, that's about 85%. And Russia and China and a few others are about 15%. The U.S. dominates, the U.S. and its allies dominate this world. And think about, again, with some of the Snowden revelations, think of Brazil, which, by the way, just had a soft coup, we can call it that, against President Dilma Rousseff, who was ousted in what was absolutely certainly a U.S.-led and Brazilian billionaire-led propaganda media campaign against her, so that they could bring the IMF and the Western banks back into control over that country. And they're succeeding, essentially making up fake claims against her that she's corrupt. There's no evidence that she's corrupt. There's corruption in Brazil, we all know that, but Dilma seemed to be pretty clean. They threw her out, she's out of power now. But with Snowden's revelations, what we learned is that the NSA monitored her cell phones, as with Angela Merkel. We heard about that too. So in case of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff's phones were monitored, her emails, all of her ministers. So let's say your name is Dilma Rousseff and you want to disclose the reality of UFOs. You're thinking, the hell with the US. Let's just talk about this. Well, you'd have to be really careful, because NSA would monitor every single thing that you say. You would have no privacy, nor would your ministers. How would you do it? Go out to the field with a little pencil and paper and whisper into each other's ear? I mean, you'd have a really tough time planning out a disclosure. So that's a big problem right there. The NSA hears all and sees all. I think most people in this world do not, especially Americans, they do not have a true appreciation of how widespread this is. Another reason that nations don't give up the secret is real simple: bribery. It's one of the great unspoken realities of the political world. It's endemic. People are bought off all the time. It's just a form of doing business. And the other side of it is blackmail and surveillance. I mentioned surveillance, I guess, a moment ago, but blackmail. USA has a really great whistleblower named William Binney, who I consider pretty much a hero, high-level NSA, and he's just kind of gone rogue. He's telling the truth. And one of the things that Binney has said is that if you get to a certain level in the political system, guess what? You're going to have a sit-down with one of the three-letter agencies, NSA, FBI, CIA, whatever, and they will let you know every little thing you've ever done that you should not have done. Every website you've gone to, naughty. Every little encounter you may have had, They've got you, and they let you know, and they control you, and they will destroy you if you go off-road from what they want you to do. This is what Binney said. And actually I heard this as well from my very good friend Catherine Austin Fitts, who is also a member of the cabinet of George Bush Sr., and she's also, like Binney, gone rogue, and she's a brilliant lady. I recommend you check her out. Financial whiz as well. So I think this is a reality. Bribery and blackmail. That's enough, the carrot and stick, to keep most people silent. Beyond that, I think most... Oh, and then, of course, if you really get out of control, they'll just regime change you, like they just did in Brazil, and they do everywhere. They did it in Ukraine in 2014. CIA engineered coup there. Beyond that, I think most nations actually don't have a lot of data on this. Again, back to military spending. The U.S. is 40%. If you look at the top 10 nations, I think the number is the top 10 nations of the world, of the 200 nations, account for, I think, something like 80% of global military spending. So it's really, and everyone below that, they don't have enough money to spend on an expansive intelligence community. Not really. Not like what America has or Russia has. So most nations are really not players, insofar as the U.S. might let them be players as part of the system. But I think most nations do not have enough specific knowledge. So there's really only a few countries, in my opinion, that would have an ability to trump the U.S., as it were, and jump in front of the U.S. to disclose. It's really not as many as we think. Yeah, there's 200 nations out there, but they're not all equal in knowledge and power. And I think the last reason most nations don't jump out in front of the U.S. is fear. Not simply fear of what the U.S. would do to them if they get out of line, but I think just fear in general of this great unknown. I think the U.S. secret keepers have a fear. I think the Russians have a fear. I'm going to get to them in a minute. And I think there's a general fear about this subject. Next slide, please. So what about Russia and what about China? I feel like I know more about the Russian situation than the Chinese, but I'm going to try to deal with both. So next slide. Because these countries, they're not under U.S. domination. The U.S. is at secret war with both of them right now, absolutely. And U.S. power structure wants nothing more than to switch out Putin and maybe even Xi Jinping as well from China. Definitely Putin, because he's too independent. When Boris Yeltsin ran Russia, aside from consuming massive amounts of vodka, he gave away his whole country to Western banks and financial interests. I mean, it was a big fire sale for a decade. Of course the U.S. wanted him in. And incidentally, what's interesting is how, in the current election campaign, Hillary Clinton's talking about how Putin is working through Trump to undermine the U.S. elections based on this much evidence, zero evidence. But in reality, what we do know is that back in 1996, the U.S. was very proud of the fact that it did influence the Russian elections to get Yeltsin back into power. I guess it's okay when the U.S. does it, though. Because the U.S. are the good guys, remember? Anyway, as far as with Russia, so Russia has a long history of its own encounters with the UFOs. We know this, there's no question about it. Particularly during the breakup of the Soviet Union, a lot came out, a lot of KGB files came out, and a lot of statements came out. So, they have just as many dramatic, incredible military encounters with UFOs as the Americans can talk about. They have crash retrievals. Absolutely several that look very, very persuasive. And all those four individuals at the bottom all confirm statements. On the far left is Dmitry Medvedev, who's the #2 political figure in Russia to this day, next to Putin. Pavel Popovich, the famous cosmonaut, really a Soviet hero, has talked very openly about UFO reality. And those two gentlemen on the right were Soviet officials in the late 80s, early 90s, Igor Maltsev and Ivan Tretyak. Both of them, I read many of their statements circa 1990. They were very candid. It was a particular moment in Russian Soviet history. Gorbachev was in power. Everything was in flux. I'm sure many of us remember this. And it was a certain moment in which there was openness about this phenomenon that's kind of closed up again. But we know this is a real phenomenon, and guys like Maltsev Back in 1990, there was a UFO encounter near Moscow that involved a Russian interceptor trying to deal with this object that then turned around and started chasing the interceptor. And this was seen by hundreds of witnesses, military. They took photographs, which we've never seen to this day. We know they were taken. The object did S maneuvers horizontally and vertically. Really amazing. And Maltsev said, look, whatever this is, there is no known technology that can do this. The best thing that American skeptics can do with statements like that is say, that's just Soviet propaganda. But this is a real thing that happened. The Moscow UFO sighting was real. It happened in March of 1990, and that statement was real. So Russia has had its encounters. We know that they have a large infrastructure to deal with this. Next slide, please. China's a little harder for me. That's a picture of Dr. Sun Shi. I met him once. He was at the citizen hearing on disclosure. He's one of the better, maybe the best known Chinese UFO researcher. He was actually the Spanish translator for Mao Zedong back in the 70s. So Sun, there's an interview with him on the web with the group Open Minds, based out of Phoenix, where he's speaking in Spanish because he doesn't speak English. And Antonio Huneeus, who's a longtime researcher living in the States, he's from Chile originally, translated the Spanish into English for Alejandro Rojas, who was asking questions in English. And it's a little convoluted, but you can listen to it. What he said in that interview, we don't have a lot about China. After Mao died, there was a lot of relative openness of UFOs. There was a researcher by the name of Paul Dong. I think he is deceased. He wrote some very good books on Chinese UFOs. Sun Shili's talked about it, and there are Chinese researchers in China. There are lots of PhDs. They're looking into this. There's not enough communication that we have with them. What he talked about is that there definitely are encounters with China. There was a border incident, a very dramatic one in 1999 involving a UFO that got Chinese authorities very concerned. And he believes that there was a possible crash retrieval of a UFO way back in 1951. China's infrastructure in 1951 was not advanced. It was very primitive. But he believes, he doesn't know. He thinks that there was such an event. And according to him, the Chinese military don't know if UFOs are a threat. I don't know how much he knows about this. I mean, he's very well established. Basically, China's a black hole for me, hopefully not forever on this. Next slide. Yeah. So regarding China and Russia, this is now my take on it, my analysis. I think that for both of those nations, UFO disclosure is a very tricky proposition. For the one, I talked about the energy paradigm. I am of the opinion that a disclosure would affect our energy paradigm. I don't see how it can't, to be honest with you. These objects are not petroleum-based. I don't see any evidence for that they are. So it implies a post-petroleum paradigm. Russia in particular, I mean, everything that's going on in the Middle East has to do with natural gas. No one talks about it, but that's the case. Russia's economy is totally dependent on that as an export. There's a lot tied in here in the global energy infrastructure for both of these nations. And I'm sure that they're both looking at non-hydrocarbon-based energy sources, but I don't know how far they've gone. And disclosure would be just as disruptive for China and Russia as it would be for any of the other Western nations. So I see a lot of hesitation, and particularly someone like Putin, who is the ultimate cautious diplomat. This is how I read him anyway. He's not someone who just jumps into things willy-nilly. U.S. will accuse him of all kinds of things, none of which are true. He's in reality he's like, in my take, he's the grown-up in the room of screaming children who doesn't do rash things. Same with China. Both of those foreign policies. China is very assertive in its foreign policy these days, but rash, reckless, not in my view. I don't think either of those nations are looking to be radical or revolutionary in their foreign policy or in their domestic policy. So I think that mitigates against a disclosure. I do see a possibility. I mean, if the U.S. secret war against Putin pushes him to the wall, Would he do something dramatic like release a secret that would be damaging to the US, like the UFO secret? All I can do is speculate. I don't really know. I might be more inclined to think he would, because he probably knows something or two about 9/11, and I think that would be a disruptive thing. But I don't really know. I don't know. My attitude about Russian or Chinese disclosure is that they are wild cards. They're not under US control, although it's very obvious both of those countries, especially Russia, have Western factions within them. But that doesn't, my brain just shut off for a second. I need more coffee. But they are independent of Western control. They are wild cards to that extent, but I do see them both currently as cautious players on the global stage. So I'm just not seeing a disclosure right now. Next slide. So what do I have here? Right, so I say it's possible that Russia or Chinese will do it. I would prefer, actually, that Russia or Chinese would do it ahead of the United States. In fact, I gave an interview earlier this year, and I kind of came up with this off the cuff, but I'm actually glad I said it. I was asked by the interviewer, do I think Obama would disclose to, as part of his legacy, to beat out, the Russians or the Chinese? And I realized, I thought, wow, I really hope that the Russians or Chinese disclose ahead of Obama or any American president. I actually really do. Because it occurred to me that what the United States has become, it breaks my heart because I'm a great student of American history and I believe in the American ideals. I'm actually one of those people. I think America has betrayed every single principle it's ever stood for. And for the United States now to do a disclosure, it would be like Darth Vader disclosing. I mean, there's got to be lies and spin and propaganda and something bad. Really, I mean this, something bad coming out of a U.S. disclosure. People talk about Project Bluebeam, this alleged alien invasion as a psych job on us to create a global totalitarian state. That's not my concern. My concern is not a fake alien invasion, which I have a very difficult time seeing that being pulled off. But I don't have a hard time seeing disclosure itself being a psych job on us to create that totalitarian state. I'll explain why a little later in this lecture. And I think that the U.S. is just the nation to do it. And I'm a little bit concerned that they may. Next slide. So let me leave UFOs for a moment. I'm going to go into just politics and geopolitics and then tie it all back. So what is our global elite really looking to do? There is a global elite, and they have a plan. That's their plan. They want the whole planet. They want to own every single thing. This is what I said earlier. They want to own all the water, absolutely. They want all the minerals. They want all the food, which is going to be genetically modified and patented and owned by them. And you're going to pay for it. We're going to pay for it. It's called globalization. It's called a TPP and TTIP and CETA and TISA and all of the transnational trade agreements that are being covertly and overtly shoved down our throats right now. Financial control, surveillance control, all of it. You can all see this. We can all see that is the direction we are going. Here in Australia, over in the US, over in Europe, and France has become a shadow of what it has been with its basic it's all but in martial law right now in France. And a lot of the other European countries are looking at the same thing. It's all going away right before our eyes. Next slide. In the US, this is what's happening in my country. I don't know how it is in Australia. Middle class is being disemboweled. It's horrifying. I've seen this. I live in a little town, city of Rochester, New York, right across the lake from Canada. I've seen it over the last 25 years. We had Eastman Kodak once upon a time. Kodak just went poof, it's gone. Now that's partly just digital age and Kodak didn't keep up, but I watched it. I watched the deindustrialization. I've watched how the globalization, first NAFTA back in the 90s and all the way through, have contributed toward the loss of what we once called the middle class. It's going away. And, we're, what is that number? 29% make more than 50,000. Most people are making much, much less than that. What do I have here? Oh, yeah, 38% of Americans make less than $20,000 a year. It's not a lot of money, even US dollars, not a lot. And then we're looking in the future. Not just globalization, but the so-called robo-apocalypse. That's a real word. And again, it's not the Terminator coming to kill you. It's automation taking your jobs away. It's happening everywhere. And I really wonder, how will people survive? Well, a lot of people wonder this. And in this world, which is becoming increasingly unstable, with a greater and greater restive population, what is the future? Next slide. Oh, so let me go into wealth. In the US, we talk about the 1% of wealth owners. Well, actually, what I really want to look at is the top 0.01%. They own 22% of national wealth in the US. So in a room of 100 people, if there were $100, one guy would own 42 of those dollars, but 1/10 of those people, 1/10 of one person would own 22 of those dollars. That's America today, and that's really the pattern everywhere you go. In that society, by the way, ask yourself, that's a society that's got a political system, it's got a media, it's got an economy, all the things that make it go. Who's in the best position to manipulate those institutions? Well, that's a question that answers itself. So in that type of world, what we're moving to, where are we headed? Next slide. I think this is the graphic I wanted. Yeah, that's the graphic. That's Seattle 1999. That's what we're moving toward, increasing. It's actually happening practically every week. It just never gets reported. Riots and demonstrations, anti-globalist demonstrations. In Seattle in 1999, this is actually a high point in American history. This is the WTO protests, the World Trade Organization. And what happened in late 1999, the World Trade Organization met in Seattle to enact more pernicious, evil, anti-human decisions, to continue with the disembowelment of the United States and the Western world. And people had a chance to protest and organize, and they did. They shut the city down. They actually were so good they prevented the attendees from entering the building for 4 days. The WTO could not convene, basically, not very well. And tear gas didn't work, pepper spray didn't work. It was amazing. Of course, what we saw was about a year and a half later, 9/11 came, and down comes the hammer. And people in my country learned, better duck my head and not speak out. Because now if you go to a protest, your face is triangulated and photographed, and you go to a database, and you live in a fear of intimidation. But this is the future. So keep going. Next slide, please. So I'm going to skip a little bit past this. What's their goal? A new system of royalty. I kind of talked about this. Formalize a breakaway financial structure. Breakaway civilization is more than just technology as I originally conceived it. It's money. It's breaking away from our laws that we create, their own laws. The end of nations, we're seeing it. Greece, my God, with Greece, with friends like Greece, who needs enemies? I mean, with the friends of Greece, they don't need enemies. They're being robbed blind. They're being fleeced. Ukraine, same story. Syria, oh my God. I could talk all day about Syria. The basic story with Syria, the reason practically no Americans understand what's happening in Syria is because the United States has destroyed it. And they'll never hear the truth. What happened was the U.S. decided to take out Libya, the wealthiest, most prosperous nation in Africa, where women could wear what they want, free health care, free housing for the poor in Libya. Nice place. More local democracy than we have in each of our countries, probably. Lots of gold. Intelligently managed resources. They were about to roll out a gold-based dinar, however, that was a threat to the system. And Sarkozy and Cameron and Obama and Hillary Clinton, front row center, wanted to take that nation down, and they did. They destroyed Libya, which will never recover in our lifetime, probably. It's a smoking, heaping wreck of a nation now. Thanks, Obama. Thanks, Hillary. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Sarkozy and Cameron. They took it down, and then they moved into Libya. What happened at Benghazi, by the way, in 2012, this is one thing that the Republicans in my country are they've gone off their meds, those people. They don't understand. They're upset because the U.S. allowed our ambassador to get killed there. Well, sorry, but that guy was kind of a scumbag. Why? I don't mind saying this publicly. He gets brought into Libya in 2011 to do regime change. He succeeds. He's CIA operative. Christopher Stevens. He immediately starts overseeing gun running from Libya to where? Guess where? Turkey, to the head-shopping jihadists there and who were going into Syria to destabilize that country. And then he gets killed. By whom? I don't know. I'm guessing Gaddafi loyalists, probably. We don't really know. That's the story of Benghazi, and you never hear about that in the U.S. or really anywhere. So with that type of a system, This is what we're doing. We're destroying entire nations right before our eyes. I didn't mean to go off-road there, but I feel like, you know, the story of Syria, the story of Libya, this is something that Americans, they don't talk about it. It bothers me. It bothers me that we can destroy entire nations and not have a national conversation about it. There will be a day when my country, has to be held accountable for this, and I don't know how or when that's going to happen, but it has to happen. Anyway, this is the world we're moving into. It's a war. It's a war by the U.S. and its EU, IMF, allies, and vassal states to take over everything, because they're the tool used to do it. They got the best military to do it, and they're doing it. Okay, next. Next slide, thank you. Oh yeah, so now let's segue back to the UFO phenomenon. These elites, I talked in the last lecture a little bit. I'd read Manly P. Hall's Secret Teachings of the Ages. It's a great book. I do believe that the global elite, if we want to call them that there are factions that know certain things that are off the map, that are not conventional, esoteric, let's say. You know, there's a lot of talk about whether the elites are doing satanic rituals, all of these awful, you can find a lot of the information out there. I don't know for sure, but I don't doubt a thing. There is a Bohemian Grove, after all, in California, where they do some very bizarre satanic seeming rituals. This stuff leaks out. You know, the UK just recently had their scandals about some pedophilia and Satanism and things like this. It leaks out periodically. There's a very dark side, it seems to me, to what is going on at the very top of our power structure. And if this is anything to do with their Esoterica, well, I do wonder. They have access to secret technology? Yes. Pretty confident about that. There's certain circles do within the black budget world. Do they understand ET implications? I believe that they do, a few of them. And what's their relationship? This I don't know. Are they vassals? Are they, is it like a Hollywood movie and they're secretly fighting, you know, organizing? I somehow doubt that. There's different permutations, possibilities. But this is what's happening. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go through a couple of different disclosure scenarios with you. Again, I wrote After Disclosure a few years ago, and that was actually one of the four scenarios that I'm going to put forth now. And I did not write about this scenario at the time. Part of it was that, well, I co-authored the book, and I had a very kind of an optimistic co-author, and I liked him. He's a great guy, Bryce, but I actually don't share some of the optimism. I'm a little more dark in my view of things, I hate to say. And I see this maybe as the front runner. Sorry, I think Fascist Disclosure maybe is the front runner of the four. Next slide. So let's talk about Fascist Disclosure. So where we're at, you've kind of seen my little geopolitical analysis. We're in a race. It's us against our handlers, our elite. So what I mean is, we've got a couple of things going for us. We have the web. The last 20 years, World Wide Web has revolutionized our consciousness, our way of communicating with each other. We've had social media for about a decade. Skype. We have an amazing way now of sharing information. The Pirate Bay. It's incredible. It's incredible, really. Things that were totally unforeseen one generation ago. We've got it now. And that gives us power. Now, the solution to that problem, because that is a problem from the point of view of those people who are at the top of our food chain, is, well, we have to control the web. Let's turn the web into TV. Let's commercialize it. Let's, you know, end net neutrality, which is a big issue in the U.S. And at some point, they're going to try to take it down. So that's one danger. Another problem is sharing, this is related to the web, sharing new ideas and new technologies. One of my fantasies, I can't let this one go, is some smart person comes up with a free energy device that's about, you know, yay big, you can hold in your hands. And then they do a nice thing. They upload the CAD version of it to the web. And on the next generation of the Pirate Bay, you can download that. And then on your next generation or third generation 3D printer, you can create it. I don't think that's impossible. Not at all. And if it does happen in the next decade, that would be a definite game changer in global power in general. It would give us, that's just one thing that could change global politics quickly. And could it happen? Yes, it absolutely could happen. There are other things that I'm sure I can't even conceive of, that new technologies, new communications would allow us, vis-a-vis the power elite, to stop the trend toward global fascism. Now, on the other side of it, you know, that's our part of the race. Their part of the race is to get there, to have total control over the whole system before we can do that. That's why I believe there's a rush to put through these transnational trade agreements that nail down intellectual property rights and you know, the whole global surveillance system that's going into place now to monitor us. I think this is what's actually happening. So who's going to get to the finish line first? I don't know. I don't know. But that's the real issue of our era, in my opinion. Another problem, you know, is that we, because of the disemboweling of the Western middle class, because it's not just the US, it's everywhere, I think, is an increasingly restive population. People are unhappy with the way things are going. Well, how do you control those people? That's easy. You create a police state, and you surveil them, and you intimidate them 24/7. You frighten them. And you distract them, too, with video games and virtual reality and all of that stuff. So you do both. And we're looking at that happening as well. Next slide, please. So, oh, yeah, let me talk about this briefly. So I'm actually working on a book right now that is not Volume 3 of UFOs in the National Security State, if you want to ask. I will get that done, I swear. But I'm working on a different book right now, which is not UFO related. It is a history of false flag operations and covert ops and regime change. And I hope to have that done in 2017. Actually, I guess I'll take a moment to mention as well that I just got a green light from what is known as Gaia TV. Some of you may have heard of it, to host my own show there on false flags and covert operations, and I'm in the process of putting that together now. So I think we're looking at 15 episodes for hopefully the first of many seasons. It's a lot of work. I'm doing it now, but that's also my book. And in that book, I've developed a kind of an analytical framework about false flags. And I consider false flags, if you don't know what a false flag is, so that would be like if an intelligence agency or a government does something really terrible, like blow up buildings and kill people, and then blame it on another group, like, oh, say, terrorists. A lot of that going on in our world today. And what I believe is that false flags, I see them as part of a propaganda spectrum. That's what I call it here, a propaganda system. And it goes through different layers. False flags are the most intense form of propaganda, but they're not the only form of propaganda. What I see is what I call cultural values. Cultural distractions are next. Cultural values would be like in the US, you know, you go to elementary school and you'd pledge allegiance to the flag. I hand over the heart, I pledge allegiance. And all of the things that we go through in our societies that make us good citizens and obedient citizens. Those aren't all bad things, but they do kind of create a system of conformity and, right, social cohesion. That gets the ball rolling. Then the next level of propaganda would be cultural distractions, like the Kardashians, like football games, like all that stuff that just keeps us off our game. When the world is being stolen from underneath our feet by a few people, your job is to look over here at the football game or Dancing with the Stars. Be happy, just zone out. That's great. That's what your job is. Look at this little trinket over here. So that accounts for the distraction for 95% probably of our lives. But then there are those people who want to act like they're informed. In the US, they'll watch CNN or read the New York Times and then become hopelessly forever distracted and confused and never understand a thing, because those are propaganda systems that are designed for that purpose. By the way, one of the new WikiLeaks that just came out showed absolute clear collusion between CNN and the Democratic National Committee. I don't know if you heard about this. I mean, we all kind of knew this, but it was very, very obvious that, you know, what's supposedly going as a independent news organization is anything but. We know this. Anyway, so that is the third level of propaganda, is news-controlled media. Spin, lies, a lot of lies are very underrated. But then beyond that, stronger medicine is sometimes needed to keep people in line, and that's when you get into covert operations, provocations. It seems to me like almost every single G20 meeting that exists these days, and I mean literally every single one, has police provocations that are there to incite greater violence in the riots, to discredit them, and to justify police repression over the groups. In the U.S., we had a long history of this. You know, in the 1950s and 60s, the COINTELPRO under J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, where they infiltrated the Black Panthers, Students for Democratic Society, which, you know, they were working for peaceful, progressive change. They were infiltrated, incited to violence, discredited. It's all out in the open. We know this. A long, glorious history of the United States. It's everywhere. So that's the next level. And then beyond that, I call shock doctrine opportunism. If you read, there's a great book by the writer Naomi Klein, American, called The Shock Doctrine. And what she says is globalization, neoliberalism, is fundamentally an anti-human program. I totally agree with her there. And to implement it, because it's really ruled by corporations, to implement this, she argues they only can do it by trauma, by shock. She got the phrase from the U.S. military, which talked about shock and awe. You know, we're going to shock and awe. We're going to obliterate the enemy into submission. We're going to shock them and awe them. Wow, that's American military strategy. Well, she argued it's not just international, it's how they rule domestically. She looked at Hurricane Katrina in the U.S., which just really damaged New Orleans. She looked at 9/11, which she didn't look at a false flag. She didn't see that way. She just saw these horrible traumatic things in which people are bereft and they're traumatized, looking to the government for solutions, and that is when, as she argues, the solutions are rolled out. Corporate domination of New Orleans or the national security apparatus after 9/11 and so on. So they wait for horrible events to happen and in an opportunistic way essentially take advantage of it. I agree with that, but I go one step further. Next slide. And I argue that beyond that are actual false flags. In other words, in which it's not simply waiting for something to happen, but making that thing happen. And that is a false flag. And not to get too derailed onto it, but I believe that we are in an era of false flags. That will be the thesis. That is the thesis of my forthcoming book. I think it'll be out in 2017. And I will try to explain why. I'll have roughly about 100 events that I think are likely false flags. False flags are harder to research than UFOs, by the way, because a good false flag is a very good covert op, and it's very difficult now to prove. But there are proven false flags. We have them. And for the record, false flags are officially in the playbook of the U.S. military and have been officially in the playbook of the CIA for many years. They're just called black psyops, but they are false flags. It's the same thing. So I will argue why we are in an era of false flags, but that's a little bit, we don't need to go into that here. So next slide, please. Thank you. And now back to Hillary and Jimmy Kimmel. So I think we're still on to fascist disclosure. This is scenario number 1. This is the longest one for me to explain. So let me just take this full circle. So if we're moving toward an era of really total global control. How else do we put it? So in such an era where everything has been achieved in terms of control, if they win that foot race, in other words, if we don't win it, we're looking toward right now a current rebranding of UFOs, potentially. I mentioned this before, from UFO to UAP, to soften the impact of disclosure. Next slide. Which will allow them to maintain total control. Now, in other words, next slide. I should redo some of these slides. So the end game, I kind of talked about this earlier with the technology. Advanced artificial intelligence, quantum computing, complete DNA control, superpowers, organic 3D, all of this, a class-based transhumanism. This is the end game. If they achieve this in a total control system, I should have put the Hillary slide a little later. Next slide. Then, I think, only then, will there be a voluntary form of what we would call disclosure. In my view, I see no motivation otherwise. In other words, Right now, I see zero motivation for the U.S. White House to disclose any truth about UFOs. I respectfully have to disagree with my friend Grant Cameron or Stephen Bassett or anyone else who believes that it's going to happen. I don't believe it. And not until this whole system is nailed down, and it's not nailed down yet. But when or if it happens, then yes. Then they'll say, oh yeah, we've got black triangles, and go on, next slide. And, oh yeah, that's a bit of a strong graphic. But, and then, you know, when we're zombied out in a total 24/7 virtual fascist mind job, then yeah, you know, if those people wanting to run our world are confident that they have total control over the whole narrative, then and only then do I believe that there will be a voluntary disclosure. Because I mean, the thing is, you can't keep this secret forever. It really will be difficult. We're jumping over ourselves over and over again, revolutionizing our society. I do believe it would be very difficult ultimately to keep the secret completely buried. So again, as I said earlier, the best way to keep a secret is to pretend to share it. The way I see the whole disclosure scenario is there's mountains of classified data on this subject that are held. And how hard do you think it would be for the US to take a sliver of that mountain? True information, it would be true, but it would be a sliver. And you release that and you use that to promote your agenda. And that actually is what I think is the most likely scenario. That's why I look at disclosure as a potential false flag. I mean, in the sense of very, very selectively spinning the reality of this grand phenomenon, and you give up a little bit of that secret as a way to manipulate the subject and hopefully nail it down for another several more generations. And then, you know, as we keep moving into the future, I'm assuming that it's a flexible game as to how to keep the truth hidden as much as possible. So that's my vision of how they see disclosure, their preferred disclosure. Next slide. So let's move into this disclosure scenario number 2, which I call premature disclosure. Sounds a little naughty, doesn't it? I didn't mean to disclose yet, sorry. So this was basically the theme of After Disclosure, which I don't have any copies here, unfortunately, but it's on Amazon. So next slide. You can see what I think it looks like by that graphic. Premature disclosure, I think, is going to be very messy if it happens. Something unexpected happens. Okay, mass sighting that cannot be explained away, a leak, maybe a WikiLeaks type of event, maybe something like that. Or maybe Russia does it, after all. Maybe Putin just throws it out there, throws a wrench into the system. Or here's a possibility. The U.S. global policy right now just backfires. I mean, America's finances aren't really that good. And let's say there's an economic poof, you know, that goes away. In that type of a situation, there's going to be a lot of unhappy people and a lot of rats jumping off the ship. And in that type of environment, leaks occur. That's what happened to the Soviet Union 25 years ago when that whole ship was sinking. Leaks occurred there. In the U.S. case, there's a lot of potential for some serious UFO-related leaks to occur. And if that happens, well, that may be hard for the U.S. government to spin. They'll try. They will absolutely try to spin the hell out of it. Next slide. You know, the U.S. would still try to maintain control over that. They would almost certainly try to give a self-serving, you know, give up a little bit of the secret, like in fascist disclosure. I'm sure that these are smart people, have got all kinds of contingency plans worked out right now. Try to divert us from the actual truth. The good news for us would be this secret would come out and it would be caught off guard, and it would be very possible that they would not be able to maintain full control over the narrative. There'd be people like us who would, you know, would be listened to, maybe, and would, you know, I remember Occupy Wall Street. Well, what about Occupy Area 51 or Occupy Pine Gap? There's a lot of potential for angry citizens to organize and demand some truth and get some truth out. The absolute possibility. And if that is the case, who knows where we will end up. It would be very messy. Oh, and as I say down here, in the U.S. anyway, this could lead to a lot of other questions You know, you lied about UFOs. What else have you lied about? 9/11, the JFK assassination. That's still an unresolved, festering wound in the American body politic. Or underground bases, or, I mean, a whole chemtrails. There's all sorts of ways people would question the system. And who knows where that would come out at the end. Next slide. So that's the theme of after disclosure, and that's one disclosure scenario. By the way, I wrote that book as a way to, very idealistic, I still stand by it, I guess, as a way to show that disclosure doesn't have to be fascist. There is an opportunity for it, but it would require people to stand up and act and to hold our leaders accountable. Next slide. Next slide. That's the slide. I should have deleted that. That's coming up last. So disclosure scenario number 3, I call insider disclosure. In the U.S. And actually elsewhere, there's a lot of people who've, you know, acquired leaks, given out information. On the left, that's Donald Kehoe. That's CIA Director Rostel Hillenkoetter. That's the former French Minister of Defense Robert Gallet, number 3. In the 1950s, Gallet talked very openly on one occasion about UFO sightings in France. And on the far right, there's Dr. James McDonald, who did a tour here in Australia many years ago, a great American atmospheric physicist. Next slide. This is the citizen hearing on disclosure. On the right, there's me without a beard. On the left is the Disclosure Project. They're into our own century. There have been attempts ongoing. In fact, it's almost like a steady stream of insider testimony and leaks. It's coming out. It hasn't cracked that wall of secrecy fully, but it's happening. Next slide. And now we have currently John Podesta and Tom DeLonge, rock star of Blink-182. I got to meet Tom a couple of years ago. He's a very good guy. These people on your left there are the 3 individuals that Tom DeLonge has been speaking to. 2 are generals. One is, I believe, yes, he's the head of Lockheed Skunk Works right now. This has come out with WikiLeaks, okay? Tom DeLonge is in communication with John Podesta, that's Hillary Clinton's campaign manager, also Bill Clinton's former chief of staff. John Podesta has been known for many years to have an open interest in UFOs. This is no secret. DeLonge actually was earlier this year, was in deep communication with Podesta and arranging like Google Hangouts and meetings with Podesta and these individuals about the UFO reality, about Roswell, about the transference of secret exotic alien technology to labs at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for a study. And now it's coming out. I don't know where this will end up. I don't know if this is just going to be another leak. It's come out. This has all happened. I don't think there's any likelihood that this did not happen. The question is, will there be sufficient spin and denial just to keep it covered in the establishment, or will it keep spinning out of control and lead somewhere? And that I do not know the answer to that right now. But this is a real possibility. Insider disclosure. It could happen. Next slide. That's a nice little picture of Hillary. Will there be a real push for disclosure? Will Hillary disclose the truth about UFOs? I absolutely do not believe it. If she gets elected president tomorrow, I would be willing to bet a lot of money that she won't do it. And if she does, then I'm happy to pay it. I mean, but I don't think it would be a truthful disclosure, but I don't think it's going to happen at all. Hillary has talked about UFOs. That doesn't mean she's going to disclose. That doesn't mean she believes in open government. She doesn't. She does not. Podesta talks about open government. I have a hard time believing that. I don't know John Podesta. I've never spoken with him, but I have a hard time believing it. What I don't understand, I admit that I just can't, my mind falters here, is how a seasoned, maybe one of the most seasoned political operatives in the United States, John Podesta, who knows everything. I mean, he was chief of staff for Bill Clinton, for goodness sake. How he could not understand how disruptive disclosure would be. He talks about wanting disclosure. I don't know how to believe him. I just don't know how to believe that. I can't think that he's naive. So I don't understand how he thinks that the group that he's working for, the Clintons in this case, are going to be able to spin that without damage to the power structure as it exists. You know, an end to the petroleum-based era, which I think disclosure ultimately would lead to, is an end to the U.S. petrodollar system, which is the foundation for all U.S. destructive, ruinous, murderous foreign policy, which the Clintons have been supporting and are complicit in their whole career. So I don't understand. And then the secrecy itself leads to too many disruptions. I don't understand how we can just naively think, oh yeah, disclosure is a great idea. So my admittedly somewhat cynical take on it is that it's all for votes. Because this isn't, 2016 isn't 1996, when UFOs were still sort of like, oh, don't discuss it. I mean, the world is really different now, and it's very much out in the open, much more than it's ever been. And there's a vote there. There is a vote there. And I think they're smart enough to go get it. And that's my take on it right now. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but that's my take on it. Next slide, please. Fourth disclosure, the final disclosure scenario, I call people-driven disclosure. This is the one I believe in. Next, please. It's about that. It's about cultural transformation. If you've read your Marxism, I read this 30, 40 years ago when I was young. Marx talked about a superstructure. I don't remember. So like the political structure was supported by the economic structure. That's how Marx always put it. And when the economics changes enough, the politics change as well. I kind of believe there's a lot of truth to that. In this case, I believe that when the culture changes, the politics will change. In other words, when there's a massive cultural change, that's when things really get moving. The big model that I keep thinking of in the US is gay marriage. 20 years ago, even 20 years ago, gay marriage was like unthinkable. And it had been unthinkable. 100 years ago, a little more than that, a fellow by the name of Oscar Wilde rotted away in a British prison because of his so-called abomination. Come a long way in 100 years. It took several brave people through the 20th century to come out. And there was a lot of cultural resistance. But guess what? We've gone kind of past it, haven't we? So now we're in the 21st century, and it's sort of like normal. And in the space of one generation in the US, opinions on that subject went from gay marriage against was like 70-30 to like 80-24, something like. I mean, it's just a total sea change like that. So that's what cultural transformation does. And I think that this is what we're doing. We're actually right now with the UFO subject. That's what I felt that the citizen hearing on disclosure was doing most effectively, by getting the YouTube videos out there, by getting all of this data out for people to recognize that this is not a silly topic. And the more that we are brave and willing to discuss this with others, the more that we are participating in that process of change. And there's no question in my mind over the last 20 years that I've been doing this subject, there has been a dramatic change. It's not total, but we're not where we were in the 1990s. I don't believe it at all. I think we've gone a long way. Next slide. So I think what we need, again, this is a political take that I have. To me, I'm not interested in a disclosure within a global police state. I'll opt out, thanks. I'll take a rocket ship to Mars and live there. I don't want to live here in a fascist disclosure. I don't really care, to be honest with you, to know the full secret of the alien phenomenon if I'm living without my own freedom and my own privacy. I don't want it. No thanks. But what I do want is a disclosure by which we reclaim our own political power, our own privacy, and our own freedom. That's what I want. So I feel like, Naomi Klein, back to her again, she talked about learned helplessness in the world that we're living in. It's like all those experiments that you do with rats when you deprive them of the ability to make their own decisions. You give them shocks randomly and so forth. What happens to them? They become depressed. They become listless. That happens to people too. And when we feel like we have no power, we develop helplessness and hopelessness. And to me, honestly, that is the worst thing possible. More than anything else, more than not knowing the truth about UFOs, it's that hopelessness. But I feel that by us regaining the initiative in whatever way that we can, developing our own independence, and being brave and fighting for this, we take back that power and we unlearn the helplessness. We relearn the value of being independent and claiming our own space in this world, independent of a global police state. So what I think we should do is whatever steps that we could do. You know, we're all different. Do various things that we can do to help push that process and give ourselves that sense of empowerment. Whether it's supporting groups that publish information, whether related to UFOs or just related to anything. You know, support good UFO research. Opt out when feasible, and that's a big, broad statement. For me, I homeschooled my kids. I did. I'm very glad I did it. They're a little too mouthy and independent at times, but I'm very glad that I homeschooled them. They are independent thinkers, and I'm proud of them. There's different things that you can do, you know, whatever that is. But maybe, like, if nothing else, like, let's not buy into the corporate news system and the corporate entertainment system that's all around us, and maybe remind others around us that we don't have to participate in that. I don't watch the American Super Bowl. You know why? Because I don't like to participate in that bullshit pageantry known as the Super Bowl halftime special. I just won't do it. It's a ritual designed, in my opinion, to control and to just take my head out of the game. And I will not ever again watch one, not live. I'll break them down on YouTube the next day. I'll look at them, but I don't want to participate. I'm not involved. I won't ever do it again. Opt out and let other people know that you're independent. I think this is the strongest thing we can do. And also, you know, don't be afraid to talk about UFOs to people. You got jobs. I don't have a job. This is my job, so I can do what I want. So I realize that you're in a different situation. Okay, I get that. But to the extent that you can, be brave. What have you got to lose? Someone's going to think you're a little crazy? Well, I'll tell you something. When you talk about this in an intelligent way, don't overreach and say that you talk to the Pleiadians. Please don't do that. Talk about this in a responsible way. Even if you do talk to the Pleiadians, where's that nice lady? She was here. Okay, whoever. Just like, be smart about it. That's all I'm saying. But be brave. I mean, most people, we don't even have understanding of ourselves, much less somebody else. So if someone wants to criticize you, what does it really matter? You know, this is our life. This is our moment. There's no dress rehearsal. This is it right now. So let's not blow it. Let's just do it. Do it the right way. Be brave. Engage in citizen action where you can. Support a free web and inspire others. Next slide. No matter what disclosure there is, I goofed. I meant to say disclosure number 4. No matter what disclosure scenario happens, it's not going to be neat. Don't be a utopian. I'm not a utopian. I don't believe, we're going to solve all of our problems. Great. We're human beings. We're not going to solve all of our problems because this is how we are. By the way, a little segue. Remember 2012 when we were supposed to ascend? Remember that? Ascension? Okay, so that was going to happen. I missed the memo, so did you. I don't want to make fun totally. I had some crazy shit happen to me during that week, and I had actually a lot of personal transformation for real. I think the universe was making fun of me because I was making fun of Ascension. I think so. But what I will say is the whole Ascension movement, I actually do look upon as a kind of mass cultural death wish. I'm not joking. I think because our world was so messed up, is so messed up, I believe that there was a kind of a psychological, right? I have I've got like 1 gram, I don't know, what's 2 ounces of coffee here. How about I put that down? Things are so bad, I think it's very easy for us to kind of go into a Deus Ex Machina mode and think, oh, well, you know, we'll just be saved. Ascension. What was Ascension? It's like losing your humanity. You transform, your etheric strands of DNA recombine and you become some etheric body. Really? That's what they call heaven. That's like opting out of the human condition. Bad idea. I think it's a bad idea. We're human beings. So let's not opt out into fantasy land and actually be human beings and fight out our system, our struggles the way we're supposed to. And it's messy and that's it, you know. Don't be a utopian. You be an idealist, but don't be a utopian. It's just not a good idea, in my opinion. Any disclosure will be messy. because probably any disclosure will not have a gray alien at the podium, so that'll leave people to argue over what we're actually dealing with. There'll only be a partial and deceptive disclosure anyway. So we'll have the culture wars will continue, and we'll probably be arguing. The evangelicals will argue with the tree-hugging New Agers over, is this evil, is this good? There's no, and I'm not trying to support or attack anyone here, but I believe there's no bridge wide enough to connect those two points of view. And without proof, they're just going to argue. The skeptics, the scientists, they're going to have their own perspective. Disclosure is not going to resolve it for a long time, in my opinion. There will be truth movements that'll be stronger, and there'll be a long, long time before we get to the bottom of this, in my view. Next slide. So this is a political situation. The cover-up is political, disclosure is political. I'm talking, I'm basically repeating myself. We're dealing with a neo-fascist global political system. I say neo-fascist, new fascism. Not Hitler, not Mussolini, not Stalin. It's something new. And, I believe in disclosure because I believe in breaking this political stranglehold over us. Confronting the world of secrecy, the black budget culture, the breakaway culture, and so forth. Next slide. Oh, yes. Okay, let's talk about this a little bit. I discussed this in the last lecture. I'm almost done here, by the way. I'm running over, sorry. How do we come to grips with these other beings, whatever they are? Next, please, George. I don't think we're ever going to be ready to deal with them. This is my pessimism, but see, here's the thing. Not being ready has never prevented something from happening. Just because you're not ready or I'm not ready doesn't mean it's not going to happen. I was not ready for my first child. Happened anyway. You just have to deal. And disclosure, same thing, probably more so. It's just going to happen. So what I wonder about these other beings is, do they or do they not support our global status quo right now? This I don't really know. You talk to certain contactees who are convinced that these other beings want to help us move on to a higher level of consciousness. Okay. The only problem I have with that is these other beings have been here a long time, and they don't really seem to me to be moving toward affecting political change and transformation. It's very possible I'm not seeing something, I'm missing something here. But I don't know, do they support or not support the status quo, or are they irrelevant to it altogether? Next slide. Yeah, okay. I should probably chill out because I'm really getting pessimistic here. And this is a real downer. Are we outmatched by the situation? One thing that we are outmatched by, I was talking to some researchers earlier here, we have a difficult situation. This phenomenon is not easy to deal with, but we really could be doing better. Globally, just in collecting data on UFOs, if nothing else, just general sighting data. We have no idea how many UFOs are being seen in Australia every year. We have no idea how many are being seen in China. Or if we do, I don't know, or Russia, or any other part of the world. North America's got a couple of websites that collect roughly 15,000 reports a year. 15,000. I don't know that they're all alien craft. I'm sure they're not, but that at least is like a raw data. There's no such collection system anywhere else. So we really could do a lot better, at least in understanding the breadth and quantity of what we're dealing with. There's a lot more we could do. Anyway, to me, the key of this is, oh yes, it's not about being happy. I'd like to be happy, I try to be happy, but it's about learning the truth and reclaiming who we are in the process of this and unlearning that helplessness. Next slide. I think I'm almost done here. Yes, so I hope to thank you very much for your time, and we'll do some questions and answers.